The avoidant has spent years perfecting their emotional disappearing act, vanishing precisely when connection deepens, withdrawing exactly when vulnerability surfaces. They have mastered the art of keeping others at arm's length while maintaining just enough contact to prevent complete abandonment. Their defensive structure has functioned flawlessly because someone always chased, always pursued, always worked to bridge the distance the avoidant created. Then the pursuit stops. The empath who reliably filled every silence, who anxiously reached across every gap, who desperately sought to restore connection after every withdrawal simply becomes quiet. The avoidant expects the familiar pattern to resume within days, perhaps weeks. They anticipate that their strategic distance will eventually trigger the pursuit they have come to depend upon. Yet, the silence continues. The empath remains withdrawn, focused inward, no longer oriented toward the avoidant's emotional state. What the avoidant cannot see initially is that their entire psychological structure has begun destabilizing. The absence of pursuit removes the scaffolding that has supported their defended position. Without someone chasing, the avoidant must confront realities their defensive strategies have allowed them to avoid. The crumbling happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Then, with increasing momentum, as each defensive maneuver fails to restore the familiar dynamic, the avoidant discovers that the power they believed they held was actually borrowed from the empath's fear, that the control they exercised existed only because someone granted it through their pursuit, that their defended independence was sustainable only when someone else did the work of maintaining connection. The initial confusion when their power structure collapses, the avoidant's relational power has always derived from their willingness to withdraw, combined with the other person's fear of that withdrawal. This power dynamic created predictable patterns the avoidant could rely upon. When the avoidant created distance, the other person pursued. When the avoidant withheld affection, the other person worked harder to earn it. When the avoidant became cold, the other person generated warmth to compensate. This reliable reactivity gave the avoidant control over the relationship's emotional temperature and allowed them to maintain defended distance while still experiencing connection through the other person's effort. When pursuit stops, the avoidant initially experiences bewilderment rather than concern. They cannot immediately comprehend that the dynamic has fundamentally shifted. The avoidant interprets the absence of pursuit as a temporary pause, perhaps the empath taking a brief break or feeling momentarily upset. The avoidant expects that their usual strategies will soon trigger the familiar response. They anticipate that the empath will eventually crack under the weight of silence, that anxiety will drive the empath back into pursuit, that the pattern will resume after this brief disruption. Days pass and the expected pursuit does not materialize. The avoidant's confusion deepens. They begin to notice that something feels different about this silence compared to previous brief periods when the empath reduced contact. This quiet carries a quality of finality rather than temporary withdrawal. The empath is not pulling back to create space before returning with renewed effort. The empath has genuinely disengaged, redirected their attention away from the avoidant entirely. This recognition creates cognitive dissonance for the avoidant because it contradicts their entire understanding of the relationship structure. The avoidant's confusion stems from the sudden realization that they have lost the control they believed was inherent to their position. They operated under the assumption that their willingness to withdraw gave them ultimate power, that they could always create and resolve distance on their terms. The empath's sustained absence reveals this assumption was false. The avoidance power existed only because the empath participated in the dynamic through their pursuit. Without that pursuit, the avoidant discovers they have no actual control. They cannot force the empath to engage, cannot manipulate the empath into chasing, cannot restore the dynamic through the strategies that previously worked. This loss of control disorients the avoidant profoundly because their entire self-concept has incorporated their relational power. The avoidant has defined themselves partly through their ability to maintain emotional distance while keeping others engaged, to withdraw while others pursue, to regulate relationships through strategic unavailability. When these capabilities suddenly fail, the avoidant questions their understanding of themselves and their relational approach. If they cannot control the dynamic through withdrawal, if their distance does not trigger pursuit, if their unavailability does not create the desire it once did, then who are they within this relationship? The confusion intensifies as the avoidant realizes that the absence of pursuit eliminates all the familiar markers they used to navigate the relationship. Previously, the avoidant could measure the empath's investment through the intensity of their pursuit. Anxious texts indicated high engagement. Desperate attempts at connection confirmed the avoidant's importance. Emotional reactivity proved the avoidant's impact. These markers allowed the avoidant to feel secure in their defended position because they could always gauge the empath's continued attachment. Silence removes these markers entirely. The avoidant cannot measure investment that has been withdrawn, cannot assess importance when their presence generates no response, cannot confirm impact when their behavior produces no reaction. The avoidant often responds to this confusion by testing whether the power structure has actually collapsed or merely shifted temporarily. They employ small provocations designed to trigger the empath's old patterns. They might reach out with casual messages that previously would have generated enthusiastic response. They create situations that would normally activate the empath's concern or caretaking impulses. They display vulnerability that once would have brought the empath running to provide support. When these tests meet continued silence or minimal emotionally detached responses, the avoidant must confront that the structure has genuinely collapsed rather than temporarily destabilized. The recognition that their power has evaporated creates existential discomfort for the avoidant. They have organized their relational identity around maintaining control through withdrawal and emotional distance. Without this control, the avoidant loses their sense of security within relationships. They relied on their ability to regulate intimacy through strategic unavailability. When that ability disappears, the avoidant experiences profound disorientation. They do not know how to relate without the power differential that their withdrawal created. They have never developed capacities for mutual influence, reciprocal vulnerability, or relational equality because their defended position made these capacities unnecessary. The confusion also emerges from the avoidant's inability to blame the empath for the dynamic's collapse. Previously, when the empath pursued, the avoidant could characterize that pursuit as pressure, neediness, or excessive demands. The avoidant could justify their withdrawal as a reasonable response to the empath's behavior. The empath's silence eliminates this convenient explanation. The avoidant cannot credibly claim that quiet self-possession constitutes pressure. They cannot characterize the empath's self-focus as excessive demands. They cannot present the absence of pursuit as evidence of the empath's dysfunction. The silence forces the avoidant to recognize that the dynamic structure depended on their withdrawal rather than on the empath's pursuit. This recognition threatens the avoidant's carefully maintained self-narrative. The avoidant has convinced themselves that their emotional distance reflected healthy independence, that their withdrawal protected them from others who wanted too much, that their unavailability stemmed from others' inadequacy rather than their own limitations. The collapse of the power structure when pursuit ends contradicts this entire narrative. If the avoidant's position was truly healthy independence, they should feel relief when the empath stops pursuing. If their withdrawal was truly self-protection from excessive demands, they should welcome the empath's silence. The confusion and discomfort they actually experienced reveals that their defended position was not strength, but rather a control strategy that depended on the empath's participation. The desperate attempts to restore the old pattern. The avoidant's initial confusion gradually transforms into active desperation as they recognize that the familiar dynamic will not spontaneously resume. The avoidant has never had to work to restore pursuit because pursuit always returned on its own after previous withdrawals. This situation requires behaviors the avoidant has spent their entire relational life avoiding. The avoidant must now pursue, must reach out, must attempt to bridge the distance they created. These actions contradict everything in the avoidant's defensive structure. Yet the alternative, accepting the relationship's complete dissolution, feels increasingly unbearable as the silence extends. The avoidant's first attempts at restoration typically involve minimal effort, gestures designed to test whether small overtures will reignite the empath's pursuit. The avoidant sends casual messages that acknowledge the empath's existence without requiring the avoidant to demonstrate vulnerability or admit fault. They like the empath's posts, comment neutrally on shared interests, or ask superficial questions about the empath's well-being. These gestures aim to open communication channels while allowing the avoidant to maintain their defended position. The avoidant hopes that these breadcrumbs will be enough to trigger the empath's old patterns of enthusiastic engagement and renewed pursuit. When minimal effort produces no results, the avoidant escalates to manufactured crises or situations designed to activate the empath's caregiving impulses. The avoidant might mention difficulties they are facing, display unusual stress or vulnerability, or create scenarios that position them as needing support. These tactics worked previously because the empath's natural compassion responded reliably to signs of the avoidant's struggle. The avoidant learned that displaying need even rarely brought the empath closer. They now employ this strategy more deliberately, attempting to manipulate the empath's empathy into renewed engagement. The empath's continued boundary in the face of these manufactured crises confuses and frustrates the avoidant. The avoidant expected that displaying vulnerability would automatically restore the connection because this strategy never failed before. The empath's refusal to engage, even when the avoidant shows need, communicates that the empath has fundamentally changed their relationship to the avoidant's emotional state. The empath no longer feels responsible for managing the avoidant's difficulties or for providing support that goes unreciprocated. This shift terrifies the avoidant because it reveals that their ability to manipulate through selective vulnerability has been lost. The avoidant's desperation intensifies as they realize that their usual toolkit of relational strategies has become ineffective. They begin employing contradictory tactics, oscillating between extremes in attempts to provoke any response. The avoidant might suddenly display intense warmth and availability, offering the emotional presence they previously withheld. They make promises of change, acknowledge past patterns, and present themselves as capable of the intimacy they have consistently avoided. These offers aim to seduce the empath back into hope, to convince the empath that the avoidant has transformed into someone capable of reciprocal connection. When warmth and promises fail to restore pursuit, the avoidant may swing to the opposite extreme, creating dramatic distance or displaying overt interest in others. These tactics attempt to trigger the empath's jealousy or fear of loss. The avoidant returns to their familiar territory of withdrawal, but now employs it more aggressively, hoping that extreme distance will finally break the empath's resolve and restart the chase. The avoidant demonstrates through their behavior that someone else could have what the empath is rejecting, that the avoidant has options beyond this relationship, that the empath should feel urgency about losing them. The empath's imperviousness to these contradictory manipulations sends the avoidant into deeper desperation. Nothing works to restore the familiar pattern. Vulnerability does not bring the empath closer. Distance does not trigger pursuit. Warmth generates no reciprocal enthusiasm. Coldness produces no anxious reaching. The avoidant confronts the reality that they have exhausted their relational strategies without achieving their goal. This recognition creates panic because the avoidant has no authentic relationship skills to fall back on. They only know how to relate through control, manipulation, and strategic emotional positioning. When these approaches fail, The avoidant has nothing else to offer. Some avoidants respond to this desperation by attempting love bombing, showering the empath with attention, affection, and promises that contradict their entire previous behavioral pattern. The avoidant offers everything they previously withheld: consistent communication, emotional availability, vulnerability, and presence. This sudden transformation aims to overwhelm the empath's boundaries through sheer intensity. The avoidant hopes that demonstrating the very qualities the empath always wanted will convince the empath to abandon their self-protective silence and re-engage with hope renewed. The empath's response to love bombing reveals whether they have genuinely reclaimed themselves or merely withdrawn strategically. If the empath maintains boundaries despite the avoidant's sudden availability, if they respond to promises with skepticism rather than hope, if they refuse to abandon their self-focus even when the avoidant offers what they once desperately wanted, the avoidant must confront that the dynamic has irrevocably changed. The empath has moved beyond hoping for the avoidant's transformation. The silence was not strategy to manipulate the avoidant into change, but genuine disengagement from a dynamic that depleted the empath's well-being. The avoidant's desperation reaches its peak when they realize that no tactic, no strategy, no manipulation successfully restores the old pattern. This realization forces the avoidant into territory they have spent their life avoiding: genuine vulnerability without control, authentic reaching without guarantee of response, real risk of rejection without defensive positioning to soften the blow. The avoidant must decide whether their attachment to the empath exceeds their attachment to their defended structure. Some avoidants cannot make this choice, cannot risk the vulnerability that authentic pursuit requires. They retreat into complete withdrawal, seeking new relationships where their defensive strategies might still function effectively. Other avoidants recognize that their desperate attempts to restore the old pattern have failed because the old pattern was fundamentally broken. These avoidants begin to understand that the empath's silence reflects not cruelty but self-protection, not manipulation but boundary, not game playing but genuine disengagement from a dynamic that served only the avoidant's defensive needs. This understanding creates the potential for actual change. If the avoidant possesses courage to confront why all their strategies failed, why they needed control so desperately, why they could only relate through defended distance rather than mutual vulnerability, the uncomfortable confrontation with their own loneliness, the avoidant has carefully constructed a life that appears full yet lacks genuine emotional intimacy. They maintain friendships that remain comfortably surface level, pursue achievements that generate external validation, and engage in activities that occupy attention without requiring vulnerability. This lifestyle has allowed the avoidant to avoid confronting the profound loneliness that accompanies their defensive structure. The avoidant convinced themselves that their isolation was preference rather than consequence, that their emotional distance reflected self-sufficiency rather than fear. The empath's pursuit provided just enough connection to prevent the avoidant from feeling the full weight of their self-imposed isolation. When pursuit ends, the buffer that kept the avoidant's loneliness at bay dissolves. The empath's previous efforts to maintain connection, however frustrated those efforts became, created the illusion of relationship. The empath's texts, calls, attempts at understanding, and emotional investment meant the avoidant was not truly alone. Even when maintaining distance, someone was thinking about them, caring about their well-being, hoping for their presence. This knowledge provided comfort. The avoidant did not consciously acknowledge. The empath's attention filled space in the avoidant's life that would otherwise feel empty. The silence removes this comfort completely. The avoidant realizes that no one is reaching out, no one is checking on them, no one is pursuing their attention or presence. The space the empath once occupied remains conspicuously empty. The avoidant initially tells themselves this emptiness is freedom, relief from the pressure of the empath's expectations. Yet, as days stretch into weeks, the emptiness begins to feel less like freedom and more like abandonment. The avoidant experiences what they have inflicted on others through their consistent withdrawal, the hollow ache of being alone without the relief of knowing someone cares. This confrontation with loneliness occurs gradually as the avoidant's defensive rationalizations prove insufficient to ward off the feeling. The avoidant initially occupies themselves with distractions, filling time with work, hobbies, or superficial social engagements. These activities temporarily mask the loneliness but cannot eliminate it. The avoidant discovers that busyness does not substitute for connection, that achievement does not fulfill the need for intimacy, that surface-level interactions do not touch the deeper hunger for being genuinely known. The loneliness seeps through every distraction, making itself felt in quiet moments the avoidant cannot entirely avoid. The quality of this loneliness differs from simple solitude or temporary aloneness. The avoidant experiences existential isolation, the recognition that they have structured their entire life to prevent the very intimacy that would relieve their loneliness. They have pushed away anyone who attempted genuine closeness. They have maintained walls that protect them from vulnerability while simultaneously imprisoning them in isolation. The empath's absence forces recognition that the avoidant's defended position creates the very loneliness they unconsciously hoped relationship would ease. The avoidant cannot blame this loneliness on others' inadequacy or unavailability because the empath was available until the avoidant's patterns made pursuit unsustainable. The avoidant begins recognizing patterns in their life that their defensive structure prevented them from seeing clearly. Every relationship has followed similar trajectory: initial intensity followed by the avoidant's gradual withdrawal, the other person's eventual exhaustion with pursuing, and ultimate dissolution or maintenance of distant connection that provides minimal genuine intimacy. The avoidant has attributed these patterns to bad luck, wrong partners, or others' excessive needs. The empath's silence creates space for the uncomfortable recognition that the avoidant is the common denominator across all these failed connections. This recognition intensifies the loneliness because it suggests that the avoidant's isolation is self-created rather than circumstantially imposed. If the avoidant drives people away through defensive patterns, if their withdrawal creates the distance they then experience as loneliness, if their fear of intimacy generates the very isolation they find unbearable, then their loneliness has no external solution. The avoidant cannot simply find the right person or the right circumstances. They must confront that their defensive structure itself creates the isolation they experience. This understanding is devastating because it suggests that relief from loneliness requires dismantling the very defenses that have protected the avoidant from psychological overwhelm. The avoidant's loneliness also carries the weight of lost opportunity. They begin recognizing what they rejected when they pushed the empath away. The empath offered genuine care, consistent presence, and willingness to work through difficulty. The empath provided emotional availability that the avoidant claimed to want yet consistently withdrew from when offered. The avoidant faces the painful reality that they had access to the very connection they now miss, but their defensive structure prevented them from receiving it. This recognition creates grief layered with regret, the understanding that they destroyed something valuable through their inability to tolerate the vulnerability that intimacy requires. Some avoidants respond to this confrontation with loneliness by seeking new relationships that might temporarily ease the discomfort. They pursue connection with others, hoping that different people will allow them to maintain their defended position while still experiencing relationship. These attempts typically recreate the same patterns because the avoidant has not addressed the defensive structure that generates isolation. The new relationships provide temporary relief before the familiar cycle of pursuit and withdrawal resumes. Each repetition of the pattern deepens the avoidant's loneliness as they recognize they are repeating behaviors that guarantee the very isolation they seek to escape. Other avoidants use the confrontation with loneliness as catalysts for genuine self-examination. They begin questioning why they need such rigid defenses, what these defenses protect them from, and whether the protection is worth the isolation it creates. These avoidants may seek therapy, engage in honest self-reflection, or risk small steps toward vulnerability with safe people. The loneliness becomes motivation for change rather than simply discomfort to escape. The avoidant recognizes that their defensive structure, while once necessary for psychological survival, now prevents them from accessing the very experiences that make life meaningful. The depth of loneliness the avoidant experiences when pursuit ends often surprises them. They expected to feel relief when the empath stopped pursuing, when the pressure for emotional availability lifted, when they could retreat into their defended position without resistance. Instead, they discovered that the empath's pursuit was not the problem. The pursuit was actually the solution to a loneliness the avoidant has carried their entire life. Without someone bridging the distance the avoidant creates, without someone working to maintain connection, despite the avoidant's withdrawal, the avoidant sits alone with the emotional isolation their defensive structure has generated. This isolation forces recognition that their defended independence was actually profound disconnection, that their claimed self-sufficiency was actually inability to risk interdependence, that their emotional distance was not strength, but rather adaptation to wounds that still control their relational capacity. The erosion of their carefully constructed narratives. The avoidant has built elaborate psychological narratives that justify their defensive patterns and protect their self-image. These narratives reframe emotional unavailability as healthy independence, characterize withdrawal as appropriate boundary setting, and position the avoidant as reasonable person managing others' excessive emotional demands. The avoidant tells themselves they value autonomy rather than admitting they fear intimacy. They claim they require space rather than acknowledging they cannot tolerate vulnerability. They present themselves as rational and stable compared to partners they characterize as needy or emotionally volatile. These narratives allow the avoidant to maintain their defended position without confronting the fear and limitation underneath. The empath's pursuit inadvertently reinforced these narratives. When the empath chased, the avoidant could point to that pursuit as evidence of the empath's neediness. When the empath expressed hurt about the avoidant's withdrawal, the avoidant could characterize that hurt as excessive emotionality. When the empath requested more presence, the avoidant could frame those requests as unreasonable demands. The empath's efforts to bridge the distance the avoidant created provided the avoidant with material to construct stories that position the avoidant as victim of others' dysfunction rather than architect of relational emptiness. Silence systematically dismantles these protective narratives. The empath's quiet self-possession contradicts every story the avoidant told about the empath's supposed neediness. The absence of pursuit reveals that the empath possesses the very independence and autonomy the avoidant claimed they lacked. The empath's sustained boundary demonstrates emotional stability and self-regulation that exceeds what the avoidant displays. Each passing day of silence erodes another piece of the narrative structure that allowed the avoidant to avoid accountability for their patterns. The avoidant initially attempts to maintain their narratives despite contradictory evidence. They tell themselves the empath's silence is manipulation, that the quiet is game playing designed to control or punish. The avoidant reframes the empath's boundary as abandonment, the empath's self-focus as cruelty, the empath's withdrawal as evidence of the empath's inability to handle relationship difficulty. These reframings attempt to preserve the avoidant's self-concept as the reasonable, stable party dealing with a problematic partner. The avoidant needs these stories to remain intact because they protect against confronting their own limitations.